Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Alabama Department of Archives and History. My name is Alex Colvin, and I am the Public Programs Curator here. And I'd like to say hello to everyone both here in the auditorium and also those of us joining on Facebook and YouTube. I have a few quick announcements before we begin today's program. The first is I'd like to invite you next Monday, April 3rd, to join us virtually for the next research rundown as archivist Courtney Pinkard presents on the digitized Civil War and Reconstruction governor papers. And then on Thursday, April 13th, we're going to have both here live in the Farley, as well as live streamed on our Facebook and YouTube, our next Alabama radio moment, as Kevin Nutt will present on gospel music on the radio. Lastly, our next Food for Thought lecture will be on Thursday, April 20th at noon, as Victoria Ott focuses on yeoman farmers during the Civil War with her presentation, The Failure of Our Fathers, Family, Gender, and Power in Confederate Alabama. I'd like to thank the Alabama Humanities Alliance for sponsoring today's event, as well as the Friends of the Alabama Archives. I ask that you all please silence your cell phones as we're about to begin our presentation. It is my honor to introduce you to Dr. James C. Brown, Jr. Dr. Brown is Emeritus Professor of History at Samford University. He has written a few works, including Fairy Tales, Patriotism, and the Nation State, The Rise of the Modern West, and The Response of the Worlds and Up Before Daylight, Life Histories from the Alabama Writers Project. He has served as president of the Alabama Folklife Association and remains active in academic and community life. And today he's going to be presenting his new book, Distracted by Alabama, which is for sale in the museum store and online at Alabama Original. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brown.
Appreciate it. I appreciate Alex Colvin and the archives folks inviting me to do a talk on my book. Came out with the University of Alabama Press within this past year. I thank you for coming to hear a retired professor whose speaking skills are rusty. And please treat this as an informal presentation. In particular, I'd welcome questions at any point in the presentation. In the fall of 1971, I was hired to teach history at Samford University, to teach European history and Asian history, and do lots and lots of what we then called Western Civ, which later morphed into world history. And I was supposed to be a Russian history specialist, but there were only two of us in the department to cover. Most everybody was an American historian. There were only two of us to cover the entire rest of the world over recorded time. So like the cowboy who rode off in all directions, I worked up courses in Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, even in folklore. And starting in the 1980s, I did a good bit of travel, some to conferences, but most with Samford students. I took Samford students to 22 countries on 5 continents on the theory that the best cultural education is read, travel, and repeat. Because once you've been to a place, you'll be prepared to be more interested in and have a higher level of skill in your reading. And if you've read about something before you go, of course, you'll see things. You'll be aware of things you otherwise would not. I was 5 times in the Soviet Union and early modern Russia from 1986 to 93. The first trip was 2 months after Chernobyl went off. And when we were in what was still called Kiev back then, we wondered if the salad would be radioactive. One of those trips on the plane back home over the mid-Atlantic, we heard in 91, we heard the Gulf War had been declared. Can you hear? We heard the Gulf War had been declared and remembered Saddam Hussein's comment that when the war was declared, he'd knock all the airplanes out of the sky, commercial airplanes out. That was an interesting trip. We set up a sister relationship with a university in China, of which I was sort of point. And I first traveled there in 88. And then our big trip was in 89. We had 18 students and 5 professors going on a 6-week trip based in this university on the central Yangtze, Changjiang River. And we'd been there 7 days when the Tiananmen Square massacre happened. And we spent the next 5 days trying to get out of the country, and finally got out a deal between the Canadian government, which had people in Nanjing, and the Samford administration, and this interesting Chinese-American businessman in Birmingham who later disappeared. We got flight out and came out through Hong Kong. I was in Lebanon working on some Samford connection in Beirut in 2005, which was ended abruptly in 2006 with the Israeli attack on Beirut that knocked down the old lighthouse downtown that was close to where we had restauranted. In 2009 and 10, I was invited to Bhutan, what was a little mountain kingdom in the Himalayas that only allowed TV in 1999. I was invited to a folklore conference that on the surface of it was about folk tales, but was really about elevating Bhutan's reputation to protect it from China, a dangerous enemy, and India, a dangerous friend, its only 2 neighbors. Some of my rural kin up in Tennessee think I'm CIA because of what's happened. And I say, no, I'm just a history teacher. And they nod and say, yeah, that would be a good cover. This past last couple of weeks in August and the first few days in September, I visited my older daughter and her family in Yorkshire. and we were on a canal boat vacation, and I came back just a few days before Queen Elizabeth died, and a couple of weeks later was at a wedding of a great nephew up on the Tennessee-Kentucky line. And the first question I got was, only half jokingly, well, what did you do to the Queen? So, but none of this obviously qualifies me to write a book mainly on Alabama. So let me back up just a little bit. My father was an engineering prof, and I was always going to be science and math. It was not even talked about. That was the way I was going. I had an amateur radio license when I was in 7th grade. When I was a junior in high school, my entry in the state science fair was something between a computer and a calculator. You input the numbers with a rotary dial, and the diodes would flash, flashing on for 1 and off for 0. If I had stayed with that computer thing, I would live in a better house or houses today. But I went on to college in engineering, and the 60s came down. That first quarter I was in school, in the fall of 1962, that was a Cuban Missile Crisis, most of October. You had Rachel Carson's Silent Spring being published. You had Joan Baez's picture on the cover of Time magazine. In late summer, early fall 1963, 4 little girls killed in a church bombing in Birmingham. And I can show you the step on the library I was standing on when I heard of JFK's assassination in November. And you had all these foreign geographic things coming on the news, Tonkin Gulf, Vietnam, where were these places? Have you heard the wicked one-liner, war is God's way of teaching Americans geography? And it was certainly true for me. And they weren't talking about any of this in engineering, but they were talking about it across campus over in history and poli-sci. So to my parents' puzzlement, but they were still supportive, I changed mid-college career to history. And looking back, I was taking things as far away from American culture as I could get. The most exotic sequence Tennessee Tech offered was a 3-quarter Russian history sequence taught by a Polish American. And I got deeply into that, went off to graduate school in a Russian history specialty. And in graduate school especially, I began to find answers to those questions in my mind that were only half formulated. It's like a line from Gulf Coast balladeer Jimmy Buffett. He went to looking for answers to questions that bothered him so. I understood Marxism to my satisfaction, both the incredible attraction and the fatal flaws involved in it. And I began to get into those eras of ideas in European history. And it came to appear to me that ideas are like tectonic plates under that slow but powerful movement that is responsible for earthquakes and volcanoes and subsidences. That's all. And the ideas were underneath the politics and the economies and all. For example, the Enlightenment, which is where our basic institutions come from. In the Enlightenment, there was this crazy idea. The key word was the natural. If they could just find universal human nature, and they had a pretty rosy view of that, they could reshape every political and social institution to fit. Does that sound like the bluest of blue sky projects to you? And yet we are continuing experiment. And Diderot said, the history of all misery is the conflict of natural man with artificial institutions. But from that comes this very powerful concept, modern democratic concept. If you are a citizen of the U.S., you and I are equal on legal grounds, should be social grounds. What a powerful idea and important part of my makeup. And then comes the response. It's very anti-historical, no matter how old or an institution was. If it didn't fit human nature, get rid of it, But then comes the Romantic Age, essentially the first half of the 1800s, and it's a reaction to that. Because something is old, it's almost by definition good. Primitive is a good word because it goes back to the form-giving time. And I found the key word in the Romantic era to be organic. Some group of people comes into some landform back at the dawn of time, and magic happens, and a folk group is created. And the truer you could be to that, and then it grows organically like a plant, true to a seed. And the truer to that seed you are, the more perfect and strong you'll be in your death. If you fall away from that, you will fall away from your own existence. Again, what an absolutely crazy idea, but a very, very powerful. I discovered the Brothers Grimm, not just as avuncular tellers of stories to children, but as high-pressure scholars. Jacob Grimm had a working knowledge of 70 languages. He was the great philologist of his day. And what he was doing, he was trying to get that 2,500-year-old essence of German culture and revive it in his day, but he ran out of written sources. So he invented this model of cultural breakdown where you'd, I need to get to Alabama material, but give me a minute to do this one and I'll tell you where it comes from. When you don't have enough written sources, to go back to what were the original institutions, there is a model of cultural breakdown you can see. There was the original religion, the Old Norse religion. It broke down into epics, and the epics broke down into legends, and they got summed up in folk tales, and they got developed into proverbs, and then simple words. Every word is a history. We don't know all those histories, but that can give us a lot of history. It's like a 2 zillion piece jigsaw puzzle the Grimms are working with, and their 4-volume masterwork, Teutonic Mythology. They try to put it back together and get that original form-giving period. And I don't believe there ever was this magic, pure culture back then, but it's such a powerful model. And more states in the modern world come from that Romantic era passage than come from the Enlightenment thing. But this folklore theme that I got into behind modern nationalism, that eventually was my bridge back to American culture, because folklore had, as an eclectic discipline, had so many sort of American parallels. Trying to think of a quick example, but maybe I should I should go on. And then moved to Birmingham, and I was outdoor oriented. I was a hiker and a canoeer. I was a Boy Scout leader and working with church youth groups, mainly in outdoor programs. And so here was a whole new world, or at least a whole new state to explore. And at the same time, I was beginning full-time teaching, and I was looking for teaching techniques, teaching patterns that would grab the students and really be of interest. And that exploration of all that is the focus of the book. The book's 12 chapters are when I first had a close encounter with 12 different topics. In that first decade or so, I was in Alabama, 1971 to 1981 or 82. The first chapter is on the Cahaba River, which I found 3 days after moving to Birmingham. My 15-year-old brother-in-law and I we brought him down to help with the move, and we'd spent 2 days roughly setting up the house and had outlived our usefulness. We're given time to go fishing. And we wanted to find a river that we could fish with hellgrammite, wade fish with hellgrammites like we used to do in the Tennessee country. And not knowing anything about Birmingham geography, we just pointed the Chevy 2 as straight away from downtown Birmingham as we could. And we took the low fork on the theory, every time we came to an intersection, on the theory that rivers seek the low ground. And sure enough, we found a stretch of river with pools and shoals. Signposted the Cahaba River, and we fished it. And I've been in that river probably an average of once a quarter now for 50 years. I've seen the natural history sites that anybody does who goes to a natural area, lots and lots in all seasons. It's been important in the family in lots of ways. Chapter 2, that first winter I was in town, I discovered the spotted salamander migration off that hillside in front of Samford. In the hardest of winter rains in January and February, they'll come off at night from the forest and go down into the vernal pools and mate and lay their eggs. And then the next rain, they go back up in the woods. And I was an amateur herpetologist, and to my delight, the State Herpetological Society met on Samford campus. It was not the semi-scholarly organization it is today. It was a most colorful group of hobbyists who kept interesting critters. One had a reticulated python so big that when he fed it, he hoped to avoid being on the menu himself. And I got involved with them and got stories. And I was taking outdoor groups hiking in Bankhead and Cheehaw, and I was acutely aware of poison snakes. And so there's a kind of a poison snake digression in the kind of a snaky detour out of a salamander chapter. But it all winds up with the preservation of that hillside across from Samford, part of it, as the Homewood Forest. Now sheltered permanently as green space. And the last Saturday in January, the Friends of Shade Creek has the Homewood Salamander Festival. A couple of months ago, we had it. 900 people came, including mostly children. Chapter 3 is on the structure that gives the fancy new development of Ross Bridge its name. But it was not introduced to me as Ross Bridge at all. It was called the Archie Culvert. I was out hiking where the railroad crosses Shannon-Oxmoor Road sometime in 1972, 73. And an old timer there offered to hike me out and show me a Civil War era hand-cut stone structure, a culvert under an old bridge embankment. It was a mile and a half from the closest road of any kind, but I went out with it. It was amazing. And then I forgot about it until Homewood and Hoover began looking for land for ball fields 30 years later and things like that. And so we brought it back to the attention of when Hoover annexed the land. And the main industrial historians in the state thought this could not have been built in the Civil War. It's too good a structure, too expensive. And but Marjorie White of the Birmingham Historical Society got involved, and proved that indeed it was. In fact, she kind of wrote, she and her friends rewrote the foundational history of Birmingham, kind of based on that research into the Ross Bridge quote, which is what the development companies called it. But and the way it got documented was really interesting to me. Chapter 4 is called Foxfire, Folk Crafts, and Folk Center South. In the summer of 1973, my wife and I and our two small kids were waiting on a camping place at Cades Cove up in the Smokies. And the truck in front of us had a Rabun County, Georgia license plate. And I had Ken at the University of Tennessee who had told me about this Foxfire project where this maverick high school teacher in the northeasternmost of Georgia counties had got his students to essentially research the lifestyles of that last generation of self-sufficient Appalachian mountaineers. And I was fascinated by it. And they were the people in the pickup truck. He worked at the school. He was a teacher at the school, and she actually worked with Elliot Wigginton on that project. And it opened some doors. And then about the same time, I had found a little white oak basket in a hippie-run craft shop in Southside Birmingham. And when I bought the basket, they gave me the name of the maker, one Henry Upchurch, in a crossroads called White Plains, somewhere the other side of Anniston. So I called him up and asked him, would he teach me to make white oak baskets? And over the course of the next several years, he did, and quite a personality. And then I was learning how to tie fish nets from old fishermen who used to fish on the Coosa before it was dammed. And I was bringing these folk crafts and slipping them into what had been my Brothers Grimm to Hitler folklore class in Germany. I was beginning to Americanize my folklore class and got some students interested in it. And they won in 1976, the bicentennial year, they won a youth grant in the humanities to study folk crafts in a 10-county area around Birmingham. And it may have been the first publicly supported, that is by tax dollars, folk life research in the state. One of them in particular, Mark Gooch, is a professional photographer, and his photography was already kind of a Dorothea Lange, Walter Evans, FSA quality visual sociology. So chapter 5 is on Sacred Harp. I went to my first Sacred Harp singing in 1975, and a lot more of that coming up. Chapter 6, whoops, I'm sorry, I'm not keeping up. So we'll do more on that in a minute. Chapter 6 was on telescoping time. I discovered Samford, such a small campus. I was thrown into a lot of contact with faculty members from different disciplines. And I was introduced to Ian McCarg and his Design with Nature, this landscape architecture, where he would start out with geology and soils and botany and zoology and ethnography and come on down to modern politics and economics. And he would bring a team into an area and say, we've studied these things in your area, barring acts of God and strikes of meteors, in 50 years' time, this is what you're going to look like. If you don't like that, conversely, tell us what you want to look like. And coincidentally, the Birmingham Regional Planning Commission was doing a series of studies, each one consciously based on McCarg. And so the students and I drove up to Philadelphia for the National Folklife meeting there in bicentennial year, and went over to the west side of town to Penn, where he was head of the landscape architecture department. And a lot of other examples in history and in geography of people who had stumbled on this same geology to future planning scheme. It was a teaching technique that really was valuable to me. Chapter 7, early on, at least as early as 1974, I discovered Tommy Bass, herb doctor from Leesburg up above Gadsden, and began to go visit him singly and then a lot of times with classes. And in a roundabout way, including going through the Peruvian Amazon, was able to introduce to him the most famous and qualified of American academic herbalist, Jim Duke, who coincidentally was born and raised in Birmingham, spent his first 7 years here, and got his start in botany from an old timer who took him gathering herbs up on Red Mountain. Chapter 8 is on experiential education, and the first kind of starting out with John Dewey's experience in education, this 1938 book, short book, series of lectures he gave when times were hard and expectations were low. This book on we've got to redo education. If you look at education as a way to give people rules to solve problems in the future, and the professor is the source of all knowledge, that can squelch education. And so we've got to work on modern problems. And so I had already come across Foxfire magazine as an example of cultural journalism, experiential education. Now I was introduced to outward bound, adventure-based education, and also introduced to crafts apprenticing education through the Bath Marine Museum's apprentice shop, and Lance Lee, who ran it and who'd originally come out of outward bound. This whole movement sort of nationwide into this experiential education thing. Strong connection with European folklore, including Appalachian ballads, these old surviving English and Scottish child ballads, so-called. Students told me about in 1977, and I interviewed him in 1981, a farmer up near Arkadelphia, Alabama, on the Mulberry River, who was a model and law-abiding citizen, except for running a fish trap that had been illegal since about 1920. And I called him up a little anxious about how he'd be about somebody inquiring into this illegal operation. He says, "Come on up, son. Everybody up here has seen it, and most of them have taken a sack of fish home off of it." So I've got a whole article on this Alabama fish trap. We got most of the rocky rivers in the state have got the remains of these V rock dams with open end upstream that funnel the water into the trap. And this and many, many other fishing techniques are all have their native, if not Native American in origin, at least have their Native American antecedents. In 1978, I first heard about the snaring of river redhorse. This one of the biggest of river suckers, has a red tail, and they get on the yellow gravel shoals in April. And they're tame enough that people with cane poles with little wire nooses hanging down from the end can actually snare the fish. And once you snare the fish, you have a 5 to 6 pound fish, and the wire noose is behind the gills and in front of the pectoral fins. And they're really, really strong. And you're standing in knee-deep fast water with the water trying to take gravel out from under you. And as far as I can tell, this method of the fish is widely spread all the way up to Missouri and the Mississippi. But as far as I can tell, only in central Alabama is it snared, and it has to be Native American in origin. But there are these families that still do it. And I looked into a family with not only great teachers, but great humorists. It was a lot of fun. And then the Mountain Workshop of Alabama. I got involved. Dan Holloman of Birmingham Southern was the real academic guiding force behind it. And he was friends with one of my friends. And so I got invited. And so for 40 years, my family and lots of other families went up to Lookout Mountain Alpine Camp for Boys the week before it opened, and had just one of the best gatherings of naturalists in 7 states. And this chapter was written as an advertisement for it, but COVID was kind of the death knell, so it's more like a memorial instead of an advertisement. And then the last chapter was, I found what I think was the last surviving railroad caller, the caller on the work gangs on the railroads that were replaced by automation. But he had retired in 1972, and by 1981, I heard of him, but by 1982, did a series of interviews. Chants and songs that he had in mind, like an epic singer, that motivated the tired workmen, that kept them safe. And it's one of the best oral interviews that I'd ever done. It was John Mealing from Pratt City in Alabama. Well, I'm told by folks who do book talks more often than I do, Wayne Flint for one, that no matter how much authors talk about their books, reading a short passage or two is better at giving the listener something of the flavor of the book. So let me take a sample chapter. Let me take chapter 5 on Sacred Harp singing, and I want to read a little bit, and then I want to show you what's typical of these chapters, in that I'll talk about the initial encounter and then kind of research into the history of it and subsequent developments, including some oral histories I did just in the last few years on these sorts of things. So let me read to you from the first of this chapter. If you're a regular in the Sacred Harp singing world, you won't need to read this chapter. In fact, I'd rather you didn't, because you'd probably point out sins of omission and commission for me to correct. But if you know about Sacred Harp only casually or not at all, let me introduce you to one of the most interesting cultural traditions of the Piedmont South, the center of gravity of which is surely North and Central Alabama. In 1974, I went to my first fa sol la singing, an all-day singing and dinner on the grounds of the four-shaped note variety. I'd been in the state 3 years by this time, and several friends who knew of my folkloric interest had urged me to go. I was reluctant to go hear what I figured would be hokey backwoods music in a dour and fundamentalist setting, but a couple of faculty friends had never been to one either, so we marshaled our collective courage and picked the closest scheduled singing we could find. It was at the Hopewell Primitive Baptist Church, a few miles south of Oneonta, Blount County, Alabama. Just go and get it over with so I could say I'd tried it. That was my less than positive mood of the day. Before we could even see the church building, we found cars parked bumper to bumper on both sides of the two-lane country blacktop. We found a place to park ours and began to walk toward the little one-room church. The singing had already started, and as we got closer to the building, you could feel the pulse of the song, incredible volume coming out of that little wooden church building. I was the first of the three of us up the front steps, and when I opened the church door, I was caught in waves of sound as if I were standing in a surf. I just froze for a minute. They were singing in a haunting minor key, throats open in full volume. They sang with no tremolo or vibrato to speak of, but with perfect chords, from a piercing high harmony to the deepest bass section I ever heard outside a Russian Orthodox church. In front of us, there was a short center aisle, and on the left and right, a few rows of pews facing the pulpit, or the spot where the pulpit would have been in an ordinary church service. In the front half or more of the church, though, the main aisle was blocked. There, the pews and chairs were arranged on four sides, all facing the center where the leader of each song stood. You could only get in on the corners of the square. There were a couple of folks near the front right corner of the church who were in charge of calling on all singers to lead, apparently one song per leader since the church was full. Often the leaders who got up would say they wanted to sing such and such a number in memory of older relatives or friends, those too sick to attend or those who had already passed on whose favorite song that had been. Some specialist in the middle of the front row would pitch or key the song. There are no musical instruments in this tradition. The song leader would bring a right hand down to start the music, and off they'd go. Everyone had a hardcover songbook wider than it was tall, but it was obvious not many needed theirs. They knew their parts of the songs by heart, all 5 or more verses. We stayed through noon hour, dinner on the grounds, then on through the 2 one-hour-long sessions after lunch. At the end of that second hour after lunch, the chooser of leaders asked us all to stand and then called on Uncle Jimmy, apparently the oldest man present, to conclude with prayer. He came slowly and haltingly up to the front and began by allowing this could be his last singing there ever. And looking at him, I thought the chances of that were quite good. Then he began to pray, soon getting into that backcountry sermon and prayer rhythm in which every phrase ends in a powerful ha or ah with a pause before the next phrase. He really got wound up, and the prayer went on and on. But then something unusual happened I later learned was called singing the preacher down. Somewhere in the middle of the church, someone started softly humming a hymn. The humming gradually spread, then the words began to be used, and as the volume of the singers rose, the volume of Uncle Jimmy's prayer dwindled, and he brought it to a close. And then, still singing, the members of the congregation began to leaving the church, hugging everybody close to them on the way out. There weren't many dry eyes, including mine, and I didn't even know these people. That was 60% of my lifetime ago, a lifetime stretching now beyond the biblical norm of 70, and I still remember it as if it were last week. And then there's a section on Carl Carmer's Stars Fell on Alabama. If I had one 10-page set of writing on Fa Sol La and Sacred Harp to give to somebody, it would be from his book. He was from, despite the chintzy title of the book, it's a great book on Alabama. He was from upstate New York, came to teach English at Tuscaloosa, late 20s, early 30s, wrote this book in 1934. About 1930, he went up to singing on Sand Mountain with a politician out to get votes and a local family. And he was amazed at the crowds, a crowd of 2,000 people in and around this one little one-room church. And when they started singing, he was amazed at these great sharp bursts of gibberish because they were singing in the shapes, of course, they had learned to sing in. He talked about the minor keys and the what he called wild and plangent, reedy, metallic quality of this strange chorus. And there was a social dimension. He watched the boys and girls pairing off in the afternoon. And then any historian faced with something puzzling, you want to go see how it got to be that way. This is the only advantage history has over any other discipline. If you watch something coming into being, you learn things about it you can't learn any other way. So this led me to the works of George Pullen Jackson, born in 1874 in what he, a wonderful phrasemaker, called the Deep North. But he moved when he was 13 with a manufacturing father to a brand new industrial city in the South, Birmingham. Spent only his teen years here, went on to Vanderbilt to college, and then off to Germany to study German language and sophisticated music. But his first book, his passion, he was head of the German department of Vanderbilt most of his life, but his real passion was Sacred Harp, Fa Sol La music. And his first great book on it, written in 1933, is called White Spirituals from the Southern Uplands. And it's just delightful. Among other things, he talks about the melody is not the high part. Melody is the third part from the top, tenor part. And he traces the 80 most popular songs. He traces that tenor melody to ballads, to popular songs, very, very convincingly. And he shows how after the Protestant rebellion against the theater of the Catholic Church, these musically starved congregations would go back and systematically get this music. They would send delegations out to the pot and public houses on the theory, why should the devil have all the pretty music, and bring those tunes back. And so it worked down the Appalachians. It's pentatonic. It's 5-shape instead of the modern 7-shape. It's modal, doing things stranger than just major and minor. And it works down the Appalachians and gets replaced behind it by modern 7-note music. And so where it survives is not the high Appalachians where you find the child ballads and their stomping ground. It's the hilly outrunners in the South. Mountainous South Carolina, the northern half of Georgia, northern 2/3 of Alabama, northern Mississippi, Louisiana, a little discontinuous patch in East Texas. And I got into the brothers-in-law from South Carolina, Singing Billy Walker and Benjamin Franklin White, and their books. 1844, the first edition of the modern Sacred Harp. They don't believe in instruments, so the Sacred Harp is probably the human voice. But the very first edition was 1844. The brothers-in-law had a falling out, and Benjamin Franklin White moved over to the western edge of Georgia, just across the Chattahoochee from Alabama. And then I found, and this is what I had found here in the archives back in 1981, 82, working on another book. There was these Federal Writers Project had these life histories projects in the Southeast. And there was a woman in Birmingham in 1938 who interviewed an older woman who had been to a singing school in 1877. Now, these singing schools that taught this music, when it came in really around the time of the Civil War from Georgia, they were held after the crops were laid by. The last plowing had been done, just waiting on the crops to harvest, after they were laid by and before the harvest, when there was a lull in the agricultural season. And she talks about, let's see, I'm getting lost here. She talks about how there were 2 weeks on average, how the boys and girls sat on opposite sides. She thought it was disgraceful when she saw mixed seating later, how everybody still knelt at prayer, how the shapes help you sight read better. If you read music already and go to one of these shape note music, you have to learn to sing the name of the shape. Seems like an added distraction. But if you don't know how to read music, shapes actually are an aid to help you. And she explains that. But let me read a little bit of that. Somewhere here in the depths of the archives, we still have this document. After the prayer was over, the singing master would call out a number and we'd all start into singing. You seem mighty anxious about those shape notes. Well, I'll tell you one thing, they're not half as hard to learn as the way you sing. Every note had a different shape. One shape stood for a note. Some of the shapes looked almost alike, but if you look right close, you'd see one was curved a little different. The singing teacher would sing a little bit at a time and we'd go over it just like he did. Then we could sing any song we wanted to. After we sang 4 or 5 songs, we'd have a recess. That's when the boys and girls go together. Some boy would ask a girl if she didn't want a drink of water. Then another boy would ask another girl the same thing. Pretty soon we were pretty well paired off and go down to the spring. We had a big gourd down at the spring, and when the gourd was filled, we drank and passed it around. In fact, we didn't dip up more water until we drank it all, and it didn't hurt anybody either. After recess, we came back into church and sang until dinner time. We all brought our lunch and spread it out and have a regular picnic. Those lunches did taste good. We had an hour for dinner, so you see we had plenty of time to go to the spring some more. It wasn't long before the boys started claiming the girls, and we'd pair off the same way nearly every time. When dinner was over, we'd go back in and sing till 3 o'clock. One of the prettiest songs in our book was, "Oh, bear me away on your snowy wings to my eternal home." You see, we all had favorites, and the singing master would pick out the ones we liked best and take turns at having ours sung. Every day when we were through singing and ready to go home, he would say, "Now let's turn to page 200 in your books and let's sing Parting Hand." I don't know why in the world he told us to turn to it, for we knew every word by heart. And when we came to the part that says, "Chords around my heart," the boys would look at us girls and put their hands over their hearts and smile for dear life. The singing school lasted for 10 days, and if I do say so myself, we all left the class pretty good singers. And although she didn't comment on this, usually on the last day of us singing, the whole community was invited to do it. And then there's my discovery of the Denson brothers, who took the tradition from East Georgia and brought it into Alabama, and began the Denson revision that take out a few songs that weren't used and put in a few promising new ones. And the first Denson revision came in 1936. Let's see, where's my... So here on the county courthouse, Winston County Courthouse in Double Springs, you can see a tombstone-like memorial to the Denson brothers. And it's shape note music, and the very one of the three-person committee that put this up in 1944 was George Pullen Jackson. He came down from Nashville to help with it, and the all of you can make out the phrase "way over in the promised land." That's the answer to the old camp meeting song, "Where now are the Hebrew children?" And way over in the promised land. It's even written with the shape notes. And when I'd go up to hike in Bankhead up in the Sipsey, I'd always look at it. You can see it right from the road, and sometimes stop and walk up to, because this has had some impact on my life too. And then there was every June, there is still the National Sacred Harp Singing. And it started on Samford campus in 1980. The Dean of Music, Claude Ray, had gotten together with Hugh McGraw, the dominant force. His 1991 Denson revision would be, he was the dominant force for probably 20, 30 years. And they had it at the Fine Arts Auditorium on Samford campus. They had the singers up on stage, which was a little awkward because it's not performance music, it's participatory music. But it got started then, and it was supposed to be in the University of North Carolina, the second year, and University of Texas the third year, but most of the people say, look, we need to have this where the old heads are, where all the singers are who still sing this. So it's still done. It's migrated from south of town to Fultondale, north of town. But every June, you can still go to this singing. And one of the things that amazed me about this particular singing was one morning coming in late was a whole African American delegation. At that time, I'd never seen a single African American in white spirituals as a tradition. And here comes a whole group from Ozark, Alabama, and they weren't new converts. They had their own Sacred Heart book back in 1934. And it's the same 4/8 music with the melody down on the tenor line, but it had imbibed a certain flavor from African American music too. My favorite song was a 1928 song about a 1926 hurricane. In the chorus, the people cried mercy in the storm. People cried mercy in the storm. The colored and the white stayed awake all the night, crying, Lord, have mercy in the storm. And I took a class of people from the Audubon Mountain Workshop down to the front yard of Milton and Pauline Oliver, stalwarts of the Pine Grove singing on Lookout Mountain, a little bit south of Collinsville. And he and I sat out in the chairs with the books, him singing the tenor, me trying to follow along on bass. And the class sat up on the shady porch with Ms. Oliver and got questions. And it's one of the best interviews I ever did. And it's still available online. And today, there are modern custodians. Buell Cobb, exactly my age, has done 2 books on it, 35 years apart. One in history, one more on the personalities. David Ivey, I guess more responsible than anybody for brand new songs and singing schools. He's taken it on the road to Europe and places like that. And then let me read you the very last page. I drop in and out of the Fasola world, but seem to need a regular fix, a dose of the vibrant musical and spiritual tradition that calibrates some sort of reset in my behavior and activities. So on June 15 and 16, 2017, Thursday and Friday mornings, I made it to a couple sessions of the National Convention being held that year in Fultondale. I sat in the back row of the bass section. On the first morning, the fellow to my left was from Burlington, Vermont. The fellow to my right was from Decatur, Georgia, and it comes straight from Camp Fasola. The fellow in front of me, also a Brown, Ted Brown, was from Derby, England. When a woman named Brown was introduced to lead a song and introduced it with an English accent, I tapped Ted on the shoulder and asked whether they were related. "She's me wife," said he. This was the Helen Brown named as the point of contact in the 2017 Sacred Heart listings. There were some decidedly modern touches in this iteration of an old rural tradition I'd first encountered 43 years before in a one-room wooden church building without electricity or modern plumbing, with wooden shutters instead of glazed windows, and with dirt dauber nests up in the corner of the ceiling. Now there were cell phones going off with exotic ringtones in the pockets and purses of some who'd forgotten to mute theirs. Oh, sorry, I was supposed to. There's the printing plate, and here's the dinner on the grounds. With exotic ringtones in the pockets and purses of some who'd forgotten to mute theirs. The chairman read text off an iPhone about the medical condition of a woman who'd fallen off a transporting golf court at the singing the day before. And the chairman thanked whomever it was who'd brought the tray of baklava for the coffee and dessert tables outside the main hall. I immediately tried to envision baklava on the dinner on the ground table at Pine Grove singing and couldn't do it. But the music was essentially true to its roots, enchanting all the singers who, as one veteran singer once put it to me, sing not for an audience, but for other singers. The fellowship was just as warm and caring as always. On the way back to the car, I passed a woman running to grab something out of her car to take back inside, apparently trying to lock it and failing in her hurry, and then just slamming the door without taking time to lock it. We looked at each other and laughed, and each said something at the same time about not having to worry about locking your car at a Sacred Heart singing, "What wondrous love is this?" So, well, I have begun to push my time limit. I'm getting anxious looks from Alex over in the corner. So I'll quit here and we'll open it up to questions.
the audience has one, I'll come bring the microphone to you. And if anyone online has a question, you can submit it in the comments and it'll come to my phone. Or ask it on your chat. Do you have any questions? Yes, right over here.
Yes, are you still involved with amateur radio?
No, when I see a license plate, I recognize it. And back then, I could diagram a cathode ray tube. I don't have the slightest idea now about resistance and capacitance. It's gone like it was never there.
You've had a wonderful life, it sounds like. On your chapter on alternative education, did you run across anything about the organic school in Fairhope?
I did not.
Okay.
Can you say a word about it?
Well, I've just read something about, I know Margaret Mead's sister attended that. It was one of the early schools, experimental schools that they had in Alabama. So,
You know, I was talking to Alex before this. She's a Creek Muskogee Indian specialist. And have you heard about the new Oklahoma Creek Indian settlement down in Weogufka? 4 or 5 years ago, I don't know how many, but a handful of Oklahoma Creeks who were, historically deported from Alabama by Andy Jackson 180 years ago, 9 generations ago. They have gotten something like 500 acres of land and have set up an intentional community that is called, I don't know the Muskogee word for it, but it's called Back to the Land. And it's a double entendre, back to the land that our ancestral land we were kicked off of, and back to live close to the land. And that's got all kind of parallels to these linguistic movements that created modern states like Israel and Finland and Indonesia. And they're very concerned with education. That's an aside. That's an aside that doesn't answer your question.
Yes. I'll go this way.
I just thought I mentioned that the Saturday before the 1st February,
Okay. Every year on the Saturday before the first Sunday in February, thank you, my fellow folklorist, there's a singing at the State Archives. And it's sung out of the 4 books that are published in Alabama. Oh, and then yes, there's one the 3rd Thursday in July at Old Alabama Town also.
And I think Ole Miss still keeps up with the Sacred Harp calendar. If you go online to Ole Miss Sacred Harp singings, they've still got, and they'll do it by Sunday or Saturday of the month. And now they're, California or Ireland, but you can tell the authentic ones, Double Springs or. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you again to Dr. Brown. And thank you all for attending. Please join me in thanking Dr. Brown one more time. As I mentioned, the book is for sale just right out here in our lobby or online at Alabama Original. And thank you for coming. I hope to see you all again on April 13th in person for the next Alabama Radio Moment. Thank y'all.